Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a really provocative discussion. It's about whether Paul sort of hijacked the Gospels.
Yes, indeed. This idea suggests that the Gospels might have been reshaped to support Paul's new framework of theology.
Right, it's like, imagine if the original narrative about Jesus was all about his teachings as a Jewish reformer, his Torah-centered messages, and then, well, Paul's ideas just came along and rewired that whole story.
Right, exactly. And the argument here is that while early Jesus followers painted him as this normal human Messiah, Paul introduced the concept of a divine, sacrificial Christ who completely upends the laws.
Yeah, the theory posits that there was a kind of need, a backstory, if you will, for this new religion to have a dramatic divine foundation. It's really a fascinating twist on the origins of Christian belief.
Yep. So basically, Hyam Maccoby argues that instead of emerging organically, Christianity might have been, you could say, deliberately re-engineered by Paul.
Absolutely. Consider the idea. Originally, Jesus was seen as a human Messiah, a teacher who was very much in line with Pharisaic thinking, but then Paul comes in, and suddenly Jesus is recast as this otherworldly figure who dies for sin and offers salvation through faith alone. It's like a historical makeover.
Right. And that raises the question, if Paul was so innovative with his theology, how did the Gospels, which are supposed to recount historical events, come to show so much of his influence?
Yeah, and that's where the argument about the Gospel of Mark comes in. Maccoby, along with scholars like James Tabor and Thomas Brody, point out that Mark, the earliest gospel we have, is riddled with elements that seem more aligned with Pauline ideas than with what one might expect from a first-century Jewish teacher.
For example, you have the tension with the Pharisees and those cryptic lessons about ritual purity, right?
Exactly, and even Jesus' cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is interpreted as fitting into this model of a divine sacrifice absorbing the weight of sin. It's like the narrative was perfectly tailored to support this new theological stance that Paul was championing.
Yep, and moving on from Mark, what about Luke and Acts? They seem to push this idea even further, don't they?
They do indeed. Luke and Acts, for instance, not only present Jesus in a light that leans into this new theology, but also adjust the history of Paul's relationship with other apostles.
Right.
They smooth over any real tension that Paul had with the Jerusalem church, definitely rewriting the narrative to portray him as a sort of mended hero.
So if I understand this correctly, Maccoby argues that Acts served almost as propaganda, reconciling Paul's radical teachings with the traditional Jewish roots of the early Jesus movement.
Yes, very much so. Acts depicts Paul as just another faithful follower, even though his own letters show he was in severe conflict with the early church establishment. It's a smoothing over of historical rigor, to build a consistent, if not entirely accurate narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Now here's a point that really gets me thinking. If the Gospels were effectively rewritten to fit Paul's ideas, then what happened to the historical Jesus? This Jewish teacher strictly adhering to the Torah?
Right. That's one of the most controversial aspects. Maccoby suggests that the traditional image of Jesus as a rebel who breaks Sabbath laws and defies purity codes was a later invention, a sort of reimagining designed to further emphasize the break with Jewish legal tradition that Paul required.
I see. But couldn't it be argued that the Gospels reflect diverse traditions, not just a single Paul-centric revision? There are scholars like N.T. Wright or Larry Hurtado who believe that there's more continuity between Jesus' teachings and Pauline theology.
That's a valid point, and absolutely a key area of pushback against Maccoby's theory. Those scholars maintain that while there are differences, the core traditions overlap quite a bit. Yet Maccoby counters by insisting that if the Gospels were written after Paul's writings, then they were, in a sense, retrofitted to legitimize his theology.
Yeah, that criticism definitely forces us to think deeper. It certainly does. And it raises the larger question, who really gets to tell the story of Jesus? Is it the historical figure with Jewish roots, or the theological construct that served the emerging church's needs?
Precisely. Think of it as a kind of historical branding exercise. Paul needed a narrative that worked for the expanding Gentile community, and so the Gospels ended up reflecting his mold, whether intentionally or as an inevitable byproduct of the times.
Right. And then there's the Gospel of John, which really takes Paul's theology to an extreme, presenting Jesus as the eternal Logos, almost devoid of any human, Torah-bound elements.
Yes, it's like John's Gospel is Paul's theology on steroids. The distinct transformation from the human teacher to the divine, eternal entity is stark. It makes you wonder, did the Gospel writers deliberately shape their narratives to mirror and reinforce the theological shift?
Yep, exactly. But here's where I gently challenge the theory. Some argue that such theological evolution is natural. After all, scriptures often evolve to address the needs and contexts of their audiences. Isn't it possible that the changes in the gospel narrative simply represent an organic development of faith rather than a hijacking?
That's a strong argument, and it's a debate that's been ongoing. While evolution in religious texts is common, Maccoby's point is more radical. It's not just evolution, it's a deliberate, systematic reconfiguration to align with a new theology.
True. It's a fascinating perspective. So in essence, Maccoby is saying that by reconstructing the life of Jesus, the early church essentially created a narrative that, in many ways, serves Paul's vision rather than an objective history.
Exactly. And that brings us to the punchline. If the Gospels were written to justify a new Paul-centric understanding of Jesus, then maybe Christianity, as we know it, is less about the historical Jesus and more about the ideological framework Paul needed.
It's almost like the faith itself was reshaped to serve a particular agenda. And that has huge implications for how we interpret these texts today.
Absolutely. One could argue that the transformation of Jesus' image was necessary to make the message accessible to the broader, mostly non-Jewish audience that Christianity was reaching out to. It's a kind of strategic narrative adaptation.
Yes, exactly. And yet, this perspective forces us to ask, if these texts were, in a way, commissioned to serve a theological purpose, are we then, as modern readers, missing out on the true historical picture?
That's the million-dollar question. It nudges us to consider whether our understanding of Christianity is a blend of history and later theological editing. The result is a narrative that some would say is more myth than historical record.
Very thought-provoking indeed. It almost feels like we're peeling back layers of an onion, each layer representing an interpretation, a revision to serve the needs of a different era.
Exactly, and each layer reveals a bit more about the cultural and political pressures at the time. The idea that Jesus originally was a far more Torah-faithful figure than what we see in later Gospels is a radical departure from traditional views.
And while Maccoby's theory is controversial, it does open up a critical discussion about how stories and ideas, and even religions, are constructed over time.
Right, it's a call to continually question and explore the foundations of belief. It's not an easy path, but it's one that leads to a deeper understanding of how histories are written.
No doubt about that. So, to wrap up, we're left with this provocative challenge. Is Christianity really the religion of Jesus as he lived? Or is it a religion about Jesus, a construct molded to reflect the requirements of Paul's vision?
Precisely. It leaves us with an open-ended question that encourages both believers and historians to keep questioning. It shows us that these sacred texts have layers of interpretation, revision, and yes, even agenda.
And that, in turn, invites ongoing dialogue about faith, history, and the power of narrative.
Definitely. In the end, whether you accept Maccoby's theory or hold to a more traditional narrative, the discussion itself is incredibly stimulating and essential for understanding the evolution of religious thought.
Yep, absolutely. There's so much to reflect on, and it's conversations like these that remind us that questioning and exploration are at the heart of both scholarship and personal belief.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, keep challenging, keep seeking, because the more we ask questions, the more we truly understand what shapes our faith in history.
Right on. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Until next time, keep digging deep into the stories behind the stories.